Welcome to Outback Outdoors. Make sure you like, subscribe, and click the alert to stay up to date on all our new videos.
Now, I'll just let the people know what I'm shooting. So this is the Fast Eddie XL with a .10 to 10,000th. And then all I have to do is take this off and put the 5-pin, which is what I hunt with.
Oh, okay.
I'm literally just replacing this whole thing. The other thing then is when I do get the Peep Sight, like we were talking about, I want to go a little bigger. Depending upon how far out I slide this, I can look at this. I need to be able to see this whole thing. Or I can throw this on, and that can also give me a different variant so that I can center my peep and my housing. Now I'm really centered. Because if you're not careful, you're off. I'm erratic. I can't get this. Well, it's because you're not getting everything centered.
Yeah, that's the cool thing about that multi-ring technology. That's what Spot Hogg calls that.
Yeah.
A lot of people may not have paid attention in the past, but if you go outside versus shooting indoors, the higher level of UV light will make your peep sight look smaller.
Yes.
So, most guys that come into an archery shop like this, obviously we're indoors, get everything set up, they're like, oh man, my peep sight fits perfect. Then they go outside, and now they can no longer see the outer ring of their sight, and their pins are floating in there, and they wonder why they get lefts and rights and stuff like that.
And this Raptor Peep is supposed to help gather light. So it's supposed to minimize that difference.
It minimizes the glare, yes.
But it does when you get natural light or you get a UV or a fluorescent light, it looks different to your eye.
Yes, it definitely does minimize the glare, that's the biggest thing. That's what we're really worried about. If we get glare in through that peep, obviously our sight picture changes slightly. We may end up shifting our head, and that's when we get those windage issues. Right now, I'm just going to get everything bolted on for the most part, kind of mocked up. We'll get an arrow, we'll clip it on, we'll tie some pinch knots or soft knots, depending upon how you want to refer to them. We call them pinch knots here. And then we'll get a D-loop tied and kind of go from there.
Okay. Now, in a situation where I'm using pin knocks with this, saves, I just shoot so much, it saves arrows, right? But then what I normally end up doing is, again, when I go to set it up for hunting, I switch to a regular knock because I use lighted knocks.
Sure.
And so, right now we'll set this up for a pin knock.
Yeah.
And then later in the season, when I get it set up for hunting, then we
put the bigger arrows in it.
Yeah.
The cool thing about this little stand here, this Go Sticks we're talking about, is it's actually a quick disconnect as well.
Yes.
So for a guy that likes to run their stabilizer, say off a lower mount, a couple manufacturers offer that. For a guy that's, say switching over to Hoyt and he liked to run his bars on a lower mount and just lower that center of gravity, you don't necessarily get rid of that feature. You can have your kickstand on it and you can have your bar from that lower location and keep that balance, that feel that you become accustomed to, to feeling there, to liking. Yeah, well, see, and that's the big thing. So when they came out with the RX-5 and they first dropped that lower stabilizer mount, if you did the math and took that measurement, by running that short little, I think they're 2.5-inch stabilizer, short stop stabilizer they call it, off that lower mount, it was the equivalent of running a 6 or 7-inch bar from the traditional location. So even for a guy that wants to run another 6-inch bar or whatever from that lower location, say you're accustomed running a 12 or 15-inch bar, you could basically go to a smaller stabilizer off the lower location and get that same feel. You get that stabilizer pushed away from the pivoting point of the bow, which is your grip, which is what's going to allow you to gain that stability.
To me, it's drawing my bow, closing my eyes, settling on my anchor, opening my eyes, and my peep set.
Yeah.
And it's left to right, like my bubble set. That's what I go off of.
Sure.
I know feel has something to do with it too. That's just time on the range for me.
Sure.
But for me, it honestly is, okay, how does it feel? How balanced is it when I'm at full draw naturally?
Yeah. All right, so I'm gonna grab one of your arrows here. So at this point, the rest is still up Okay, still in its upright location. I have not yet set the timing. That knock fits really good. So from this point here, obviously, you know, we need to get a D-loop tied on, but we want to make sure that arrow is set up in a reasonably level position. Some bows are going to have a tendency to tune a little bit knock high. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that as long as it's not excessive, you know, as long as we're not going crazy with it. A lot of times from the factory, you're going to have that little string bump, right? It's going to be pushing up against the string. Well, obviously, if it's pushing against the string, if it bows the string out, I'm going to get a false level for the string.
So you loosen that in order to...
I can't find the right size wrench here. Yeah. I'm going to loosen that in order to pull it away from... Is this it? Oh, there we go. To push it away from the string.
So
I do you see that? Do you see the string just shift forward?
Yeah.
So I'll push that off of there so I know that that string is running perfectly plumb.
And then when you put that back, do you just want it barely touching?
I want just the tiniest gap.
So maybe even a 16th?
About a 16th gap. Yep.
Okay.
I don't want it to push away. And I find, you know, and this is something that everybody can play with. Because, for instance, the RX-1 series. Okay, I shot an RX-1. I still have it. Still love that bow. That bow I found to be the most quiet when I had that string bump just barely over an eighth away from the string. Okay. Rather than pressed right up against it. And I just contribute that to the, you know, obviously the string travels forward, hits that bump. I don't want that string to just absolutely slam into it. Obviously, if I go a little bit inside of what would be the brace height, that string starts to slow down a little bit, and then it just kisses it and kind of kills some of that vibration. But that's what I noticed. You can play with that on any bow. So now I've got that bow perfectly plumb, that string's plumb. It's exactly where we want to see that. I'm going to just go ahead and grab that arrow and slide it down along that serving and look at my level that I have here on the arrow. And while I do that, I'm just taking a quick glance at where that arrow goes through the burger button hole, okay, or the rest bolt hole, because that is essentially the center of your bow, okay? Now, I find in a lot of instances, Hoyt specifically, they're going to tune very well at the true center. But I have noticed on some binary cam bows to sit just a little bit above true center is not necessarily a bad thing. I'd always rather that rest or arrow sit a little bit above true center than
below?
Than ever be below. Yep. All right. There she is. So right now I'm just going to go ahead and raise that rest up just the slightest bit. I'm just going to bring it up about a 1/16 above true center.
Okay.
That looks awesome.
Okay, and then you'll just snug it up?
Down, yep. So, again, I mentioned earlier we're going to tie some pinch knots on there. Pinch knots, it's basically just a tied knock set. It allows us to hold our marking on that string. So for a guy that shoots quite a bit, or let's say, for instance, you know, I've had some customers come in where they're having issues with their release and they have the tiniest burr on it and it starts chewing up D-loops. Well, man, is it a frustrating thing if we don't have pinch knots and we're replacing D-loops all the time? Because every time I cut the D-loop off, I go through the tuning process again, right? But with pinch knots, it kind of saves our space and it allows us to, say, replace a D-loop. And I really like pinch knots for the fact that if something like that ever happened and I needed to change it in the field, I don't have a vise.
Right.
I don't have a level. So at that point, I'm guessing, right? Well, this way, I'd be able to take that D-loop off. Let's say it broke. I'd be able to take that D-loop off and tie a new one on, lickety-split, and be right back hunting.
And I have done that.
Yeah,
so you're exactly right. Yep. By having that on there, that does allow you to very, very easily get that set up.
Yeah. Cool. Trying to get this sucker just about dead level. So these pinch knots that I'm tying, it's just a series of basically double overhand knots, but they're in a sequence where I'm alternating them on each side of the string. I'm seeing that.
So you're double. It's a double overhand knot. Yep. Then you cinch it down, and then you go to the other side, double overhand knot, and come. I noticed that. Okay.
Yep. Now, I usually like to count the amount of knots I have on basically what I consider the shooter side of the string, just so I keep a consistent knock size.
And what do you go for?
I usually do 4.
4.
So
okay.
4 on the shooter side. So right now I've got 1, 2, 3. So we're gonna do another series here.
Series. And will you start on the shooter side? Always start on the shooter side? Okay.
I prefer to, yes. Okay. Now, when I'm finishing this knot, okay, I've done my series of 4 on the shooter side. I'll do a single overhand knot directly on top.
On the last one.
On the last one. And what that does is essentially it creates a square knot. It locks them together so they can't come untied. Okay. So I'm going to pivot that bow down because I'm going to burn it down. Flames go up. I don't want to burn your string.
Right.
So I'll push your arrow out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and hit that top tag end. I'm going to start melting that down. And I'm going to push that burnt end on top of that knot.
On top of the knot that you just created.
Exactly. And essentially what this is doing, okay, because I'm melting that down, I'm using that melted portion of this material like glue. So basically I've got that square knot, should not be able to come untied. But now when I melt everything down, I press it over top of that knot, it's like gluing it all together. Bingo, just like that. Nice clean little tied knock set. Now that knock can't go up above plumb. That's awesome. Now I'm going to tie the bottom one. Now this is the most critical part about that bottom knot. You do not want it, if you're doing this at home, you do not want that bottom knot touching your knock in this position, okay? And the reason why you don't want it touching the knock is obviously right now our string is perfectly straight, right? But as we draw, okay, our string comes to an angle, these knots are essentially going to basically get pressed.
And that's where
together.
you get your arrow rising up because you have string pinch.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. So these, we refer to these as pinch knots. Okay, the concept is to minimize pinch.
Okay. Now, what is the amount of space you give yourself?
So,
is that a double overhand?
That's a double overhand. Okay. Yep, that's a double overhand. So, that spacing is going to vary, obviously, based on knock size. Okay?
Right.
But the space from the bottom of the knock to that bottom pinch knot is going to vary, in my personal opinion, based off of draw length and axle length, because the string angle changes. So for a person that, say, has a really short draw length that's shooting a really long axle bow, let's say a target bow, okay, that spacing between that pinch knot and the bottom knock, or pinch knot and the knock, is probably going to be pretty small, okay, because that string angle isn't super harsh. But let's say you've got a guy that's got a 30-inch draw length and he's shooting a 29-inch or 30-inch axle bow, he's going to have a very steep string angle, okay, so those knots are going to get forced together, so we want to open it up. But I would say if we're going to give it, just a rule of thumb, I like to have that pinch knot be at least a 1/16 of an inch off the bottom of that knot. Okay. So just about like so.
So you are a 1/16, and then will you do the same 4 and 4?
I do 5 on the bottom, actually. So,
really?
And the reason why I do 5, I add that additional. The reason why I do that is when we tie that D-loop on there and you draw the bow back, the bottom knot of that D-loop, if it were to ever try to migrate, is always going to try to migrate up into that knock, and I want to keep that pressed down and pushed away.
So you got your D-loop on.
Yep, so we went ahead and tied the D-loop. So again, we already had to put the pinch knots on there, got all that spacing. Obviously you can see if I wiggle that arrow, there's a little bit of gap in there. Again, that's just for those knots to come together so we're not creating pinch, okay? A D-loop is just a series of half hitches.
Right.
I'm gonna take a little piece of D-loop material just to show you guys this real quick. Just kind of real fast since we jumped ahead. In order to tie a D-loop, you really need about 4 3/4 inches of material. okay, in order to tie it. So I cut a chunk of D-loop material off. Again, this is gonna be real quick. You're gonna fluff that end on it. That way when you melt it down, okay, and I'm emphasize you melt it, don't burn it, okay? If you burn it, if it starts to create a flame, okay, and you blow that flame out, essentially what you're doing is you're gonna cause that ball or all that material to get very crystalline, okay? And then once it cools, you pull on it real hard and it cracks, okay?
And it'll pop off in your hand.
Exactly. A lot of times it'll pop off in your hand. If it doesn't, it's gonna pop off while you're pulling your bow back and you're gonna punch yourself in the face, okay? So you wanna just melt that down and create a little ball on there. And what that ball is gonna do is when you tie that half hitch knot, it's gonna keep that tag end from pulling through the knot. This is what really holds it down and binds it, okay? So I'm gonna make sure that that's cooled. Yep, for sure. And again, we're gonna tie a series of half hitches. This is the way that I tie on all my D-loops. It's about the easiest way I can explain to tie a D-loop, but it's essentially, it is essentially a series of half hitches, and in order to do those, we're creating loops, okay? So I take my D-loop material, I fray it, I burn it down, okay? I create a J with it, essentially, okay? And I'm gonna lay that up against the string, okay? Now, if we're looking here, you see I've created a loop. I'm gonna take both tag ends, push them through the loop, okay? So that's one.
Your short little one with the ball.
Two, yep. And I'm gonna pull that snug. That is your upper knot of a D-loop. Now, what I'm gonna do is I want these knots to alternate, okay? So now I'm paying attention to where this little burnt end is, okay? On whether it's a right-handed shooter or a left-handed shooter, on the top knot, I want that burnt end to be away from the shooter, okay? So you're left-handed, so I've got that burnt end on the left-hand side, okay? I'm gonna take my main tag line and I'm gonna lay it on the string on the side of that burnt end, okay? You see that there? Let me kind of get my fingers out of the way so you can see it. I've created this little loop here, okay? I'm gonna take this tag end and wrap it around the string and go through that loop, okay? It's a series of loops. Now, because I want it alternating, I need to go back around the string, okay? On the off side, okay? I've created another little loop right here, another little hole. I push that tag end through it. I pull it tight. That's the bottom knot.
It's so simple, but you get in there and the next thing you know, you've tied it and you realize, oh crud, I have it on the same side.
Yep.
Now, would that make that big of a difference? I don't know. The way it pulls back, is it gonna shift the arrow or the knot?
Yeah, it won't shift the arrow or anything like that. The downside when you take those half hitches and you have them both, say the burnt ends on both sides of the string, okay, or the same side of the string, excuse me, is you won't truly get them to cinch down.
Right.
So because they're alternating, they actually work against each other.
Right.
So when you go to cinch them down and tighten them up, if one was to try to loosen, the other one would try to tighten.
Right.
Okay? So it keeps that D-loop from coming untied. It keeps it from migrating around the string. Right. There's nothing more frustrating than when you tie a D-loop on there and you get the peep sight all in there and lined up, and you shoot a couple times and the D-loop migrates around, and now you can't hook your release up and you're manipulating the string. Now your peep sight's not straight. It's just, it causes a lot of frustration.
Sure.
Okay, so now we've got all that. Yep,
now you'll bring that back out to 16th.
Yep, so I want just that tiny little gap. Let's see if I can't seem to find it. Boom. That's pretty close right there. And I'll snug that up.
Thanks for watching Outback Outdoors. We encourage you to comment below, and as always, like, subscribe, and click the alert to stay up to date on all our new videos.